So welcome everyone to this EPP Group podcast on EU-China relations. How do you deal with a country that is your biggest trading partner and at the same time has human rights issues and geopolitical issues? That's what we're here to talk about with Miriam Lexmann of Slovakia, a member of the European Parliament, of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the subcommittee on security and defense. You were blacklisted by China after the EU imposed sanctions, tit-for-tat. And Radosław Sikorski, welcome. We'll call you Radek for short. You are from Poland. You're also a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. You used to be the foreign minister in Poland, and you're also on the subcommittee on security and defense. And you're author of the new EPP Group strategy paper on China. And joining us from Berlin is Noah Barkin, a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund, a highly respected think tank, and the managing editor at Rhodium Group. That is an independent research provider working with leading think tanks and universities in Europe, Asia, and the US. Let's start with a few facts. As we mentioned, that China is the main trading partner for the EU. There's a new investment agreement to lower barriers for investment that is yet to be approved by the European Parliament. It's also a strategic partner for the EU in certain aspects for fighting climate change, for the global transition to renewable energy. So, you know, there's you might say yin and yang here, but there are human rights issues involving the Uyghur in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong. Madame von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, said that China is a systemic rival. And then we talk about these sanctions against Beijing, the EU, and also the US, the UK, and China imposed sanctions over China's treatment of the Uyghur in Xinjiang. And those sanctions by the Chinese were not only, of course, against Miriam, but against 4 other members of the European Parliament. So a lot to talk about here. We're trying to cover as much ground as we can. Miriam, you were criticized by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, among the others, as severely harming China's sovereignty and interests and maliciously spreading lies and disinformation. What kind of lies and disinformation are you spreading?
Well, I have to say that these sanctions against me came as a surprise, and especially the language China has used, because I'm in politics literally 1 year. I joined the European Parliament in February last year. So how can I create such a big danger for such a big country, an influential country? I'm not sure. But of course, I have been a critic of the Chinese Communist Party as someone who comes from an ex-communist country, the former Czechoslovak communist country. I think I can read maybe naturally, because I come also from a distant family, so I could read some of the steps of the Chinese Communist Party. And I was surprised that the West did not deal with China as a communist regime, but we kind of fell into the trap that we started to deal with China as our partner, mainly as our economic partner.
Right.
And I have been a big critic of the human rights situation, the Chinese international aggressive, more and more so aggressive behavior. I have been a critic of the human rights situation in mainland China, in Hong Kong, and also the way how China is breaching international treaties and international deals. Right. So I'm also a co-chair of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, and as well as a co-chair and co-author or co-founder of informal European Parliament's cross-party group, Hong Kong Watch Group.
So maybe more reasons for you to get yourself into trouble in this case.
Yes, this brought me into trouble. Yeah.
Right, in a good way, actually. Let me turn to Noah. Noah, you quoted recently one of Germany's officials as saying, "We slapped them on the fingers, the Chinese, and they punched us in the face." Did China punch Europe in the face, according to you?
Well, that's certainly how people here in Berlin are seeing it. But I think what's interesting is that we've had European capitals in de-escalation mode since these sanctions were imposed on European lawmakers, also on European academics, European research institutions. So I think that has been a bit surprising to me. Perhaps it shouldn't have been. We saw German Chancellor Angela Merkel speaking with Xi Jinping last week. They did a call with Emmanuel Macron just in recent days, and in the readouts of those calls, there's been no mention of the sanctions, which I found quite astonishing.
Although I guess maybe that the communication lines are still open is a positive thing, no?
Well, it's certainly important to continue to talk with China. But I think European governments certainly need to stand up and condemn this, what was really a disproportionate sort of asymmetric response to the EU's decision to impose travel bans and asset freezes on 4 Chinese officials tied to the abuses in Xinjiang. So this is really a disproportionate response, and European governments need to speak up and defend their lawmakers and their academics.
Well, let me turn to Radek and the report that you authored last month. You say in this report, you say cooperate where possible, compete where needed, confront where necessary. Are we in that third stage of confrontation? I mean, not military, but we are facing off, right?
In some narrow areas. Look, China is a very important country that has a history of much worse repressions in the past. During the Cultural Revolution, during the Great Leap Forward, tens of millions of people died.
Yeah.
And it's also, the relationship is a product of our failed bet. In the early 1990s, we bet that if China becomes wealthier, if we admit China into the World Trade Organization,
they'll become more democratic.
If we give it the status of a market economy, they would liberalize at least in the economic sphere. And maybe one day also in the political sphere.
Yeah.
This hasn't happened. So this is a product of, I'm afraid, our failure. And I think also of Chinese mistakes. I think it's a mistake to sanction European lawmakers because it makes the passage of the investment agreement less likely.
Yeah.
Because people are saying, well, look, why is China playing hardball, as we've heard?
Yeah.
And it is China that has dropped the Deng Xiaoping policy of build your strength and play for time, and adopted quite openly the wolf warrior diplomacy of Xi Jinping. So China has become more aggressive, which I think is a mistake because it is creating ill will towards China around the world and is forcing countries into an alliance of countries that are now afraid of China.
Now let's talk about this investment agreement. It's called the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment with China. It is still subject to approval by the European Parliament. It allows greater access to Chinese markets by European businesses. That's what the European businesses were demanding for so long, right?
And
but
what the Commission tells us is that it comes to the level of the stage 1 U.S. agreement with China. So we're just doing catch up.
But it's an important step. But what's your thought on this? I mean, should the European Parliament jettison this, or are we shooting ourselves economically in the foot by not approving it?
First of all, I'm told the text is not ready. What happened at the end of the German presidency was a political agreement to try to get it ready, but it is not yet. And of course, we will examine it very carefully. There are provisions there that encourage China to join and sign up to the International Labour Organization conventions against forced labor. That will be examined in great detail.
Okay, so the jury's still out, in other words. And I guess same thing with Miriam. I mean, you're on China's blacklist. Are you ready to vote for this investment agreement that would benefit a lot of businesses, right?
I think it would be a great mistake if the Parliament will close eyes again. I mean, about the sanctions and ratify or kind of scrutinize and ratify the treaty while having members of the Parliament sanctions. I think this this should not happen because we need to react to these sanctions. It's not only the members, but also it's the full human rights subcommittee which is sanctioned. So I think that this is a big step from China vis-à-vis us, and I don't think we should continue with the ratification, but while having sanctioned members and a subcommittee. But you mentioned the economic interest, and Radek already mentioned the human rights issue, where we demand that at least China will sign up for the ILO convention.
International Labour
we believe,
Organization.
yes, because we believe that this is there is a potential to improve human rights, at least from the sector of the labor rights. And if we don't fulfill, that means that we are morally failing. I don't think we can admit to say that, okay, if the wording in the document, and as Radek said, we still don't have the final wording, if the wording is saying only that China should get closer to the standards, to ILO standards, I don't think I can vote for it, because I know that China will not.
Right.
China will ignore it, and this has happened now with South Korea, exactly the same thing. The results of the court case was that South Korea did not say that they are going to ratify. That means they don't need to implement it, or they don't need to get even closer, because the time when they get closer to the standards, it's up to them.
Right.
But I will also come to the economic interest, because I don't think we are meeting the potential of this treaty even in the economic interest. We are not protecting, for example, our companies from the Chinese intellectual thefts, which is a huge loss for our market. Yes, it supports some of the big companies, but it doesn't meet the potential to protect our smaller businesses, particularly in the area of the technology thefts, the property thefts. And in the US, the calculations is that the loss through the Chinese intellectual property thefts are from 200 to 600 billion a year.
So you're saying though that you're not outright saying no, that you won't vote for it, and Radek as well. I think both of you are saying that if there are improvements, or if there are changes, that maybe you might, right?
Yeah, if we are going to meet the potential of the treaty, because there are potentials in terms of human rights, in terms of economic improvements, and if the treaty will meet the potentials, I am ready to vote for it, but I don't think it will, because from what we hear already now, it doesn't seem like.
Well, Noah, let me ask you, now, considering the economic crisis that Europe is facing, can we afford to jettison this investment agreement?
Well, this investment agreement, in my reading, is very much an incremental deal. Mr. Sikorski mentioned that it's a catch-up to the phase one, which was also a very incremental deal. So I don't think that this is a deal that wouldn't be approved, even if it is approved, until next year. It's going to take quite a while for European companies to actually benefit from what is in this deal. And there are many of the market access gains that are, there are caveats, and many of them are, they're sort of embedding promises that China made over the past years into an agreement. So this is not a big leap forward. It's a baby step. And I don't think that if this deal doesn't happen, that it'll be big negative for the European economy.
No great loss. So you're not arguing that we should accept it now as is, as a tiny step, and then go for a better deal later? No.
Well, what I'm saying is it's an incremental deal, and I think I would agree that I don't have the insight into the European Parliament's thinking that our other guests have, but it's just hard for me to imagine that a deal that following the imposition of sanctions on European lawmakers who have to approve this deal, that they would then approve it.
Okay, well, let's zoom out a bit, Radek, and let's look at EU policy toward China in general. I mean, you said it's outdated. What do you mean by that?
Well, China used to be a populous but very poor country.
Yeah.
And 20 or 30 years ago, our sanctions would have been effective, because it was China that was seeking access to our markets. Today, China is one of the 3 largest economies on earth. together with us and the United States, and is an emerging superpower. So we no longer can have merely a trade policy towards China. This has to be a mature policy towards a country that has a sense of itself as returning to a position of great influence in the world. And there are some serious dangers out there. For example, that the organizing principle of the rest of the first half of this century will be a Sino-American rivalry for who is number one in the world. And as Europeans, we will be torn on this because on the one hand, we need to continue to trade with China.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the United States is our close ally.
Right.
So we need to have policies that will moderate that relationship out there.
And that we have to find common ground within the EU itself, because there are divisions within the EU in the approach toward China, right?
Well,
there are some countries that are a bit
Chi-
more friendly to China than others, right?
China is the kind of issue on which I think every European country has to realize it's a small country. You know, Poland is the size of a Chinese city you have never heard of. And Germany is the size of one province. Of course, as individual countries, we have no hope of influencing China.
Collectively, you need
Only as the European Union can be an equal partner with China.
Okay, Miriam, how do you see it yourself? Similar or?
I see similarly. What I think what we need to do is to kind of rethink our strategy vis-a-vis China, what we are doing. But what is important is that we should no longer have our economic policy vis-a-vis China, our human rights policy vis-a-vis China, our security policy vis-a-vis China, because it won't work. We have to bring all these compartmentalized policies into one very coherent strategy. And this strategy, I believe, because Radek said that we don't want to appear in a situation that China and US are kind of rivals and we have to choose, or we need to see what is our place.
Yeah.
I think our partner is the US, our partners are democratic part of the world, and we have to coordinate with them. We have to coordinate, I say, with them our policy vis-a-vis China. Of course, we can have independent policies, but the policies should somehow be coordinated, be discussed. We need to learn from each other, take examples. For example, I mean, we were discussing the KAI before. What happened is that Australia has an economic deal with China. China doesn't play according to the deal. So we have to be ready. We have to learn that to have a deal doesn't mean that China is acting according to the deal.
Yeah.
So I think this is very important, is that we have to have one policy where we are not compromising on our values and our human rights policy because of our economic interests, because this will turn against us. The policy should be one, and the policy should be based on our values and should be coordinated with our allies.
Yeah, Noah, let me ask you, what is your take on this? And considering that for the EU to act, at least on the council level, it has to be unanimous on these things. Like, for instance, suspending the extradition treaties. There are some countries that are standing in the way of doing that. I mean, I'm reading today about Hungary, for instance, not being positive on that. How do you see this? How can Europe actually reorient its policy when it's held up by that kind of thing?
Well, I think it starts with the big countries like Germany and France. I think one of the problems, although German Chancellor Angela Merkel has talked about the need for a common European policy on China, is that Germany has not really been willing to pay an economic price for a tougher policy towards China. There's this 17+1 forum, which includes Poland, and that is criticized a lot here in Berlin. But Berlin is pursuing its own agenda as well, and I don't think Germany or France have really done enough to sort of bring European countries together behind a more realistic policy, which does not compartmentalize in the way that we're seeing in Europe now. Pretending that you can do business on Monday and you impose sanctions on human rights sanctions on Tuesday. It's very difficult to keep that juggling act going, I think, and will be more difficult with the Biden administration putting pressure on Europe.
Okay, Radek, Noah mentioned 17+1, but couldn't it be beneficial for countries like Poland at 17+1?
Yeah, but he also mentioned that Germany is freelancing with China, which it is. The common ground is obvious. We should do what the Treaty of Lisbon says. Carry out the treaty, which says that we should agree the policy in the Foreign Affairs Council and then loyally support the High Rep and the President of the Council in carrying it out.
Yeah, but that's not happening.
And it's not happening on any of the most important issues, with a huge loss to our effectiveness. And China is the kind of challenge which I hope will concentrate minds, because competition with China is inevitable. Because of the dynamics, because of the ideology, because of the system of alliances and so on. The point is to manage the competition in such a way so as not to lose the trade and so as not to allow it to boil over, because it's the last thing we should wish.
The 17+1, I should explain, it's 2 months ago, China held a virtual 17+1 meeting with Eastern and Southern European countries. And this is what we're talking about here, is to what extent are those countries perhaps doing their own dealings with China and maybe undermining European policy? What about some of the candidate countries like Montenegro, which has a €1 billion road loan from China? And some could see that as debt diplomacy, turning up the screws on countries like Montenegro. How much are you concerned about this?
Fell in the same trap as Sri Lanka before, and I think as allies we need to exchange information, coordinate, and warn allies that there are some consequences.
Warn them, but the EU said we're not going to bail you guys out.
Well, warn and bail out is not the same thing.
Right, that's true.
But look. Smaller countries in Central and Eastern Europe feel that China is not going to pay attention individually to them. So when China comes and says, look, you can have a somewhat similar relationship that we have with Germany, with privileged access, but if you stick together, that's attractive to them.
Okay.
So Germany needs to get serious about this and say, right, we will allow all of the EU into the kind of relationship we've had with China, and from now we will pursue the policy together.
Okay.
And then it makes sense.
Let me, because we're running out of time, but I'd like to cover on how we can better cooperate. And the Europeans, the Americans are talking to the Chinese about how to better cooperate on fighting climate change, on the energy transition. Noah, what potential do you see there, and how can that perhaps save the relationship in that sense?
Well, climate is the topic that everyone holds up as an area of potential cooperation, and I think it is good to see European leaders talking with Xi Jinping about climate. It's been the Americans who've been sort of absent on this issue under the Trump administration, but I think Europe needs to talk with China about climate, but it shouldn't be under any illusion that it needs to accommodate China on other issues in order to get China's buy-in on climate change. China will move on climate change because it's in its own interest. It's not going to be encouraged to move because European countries or the U.S. is being more conciliatory on other issues.
But is that an issue maybe to keep separate from human rights issues and geopolitical issues? Is that possible to do? I mean, I understand that the meeting between John Kerry and the Chinese recently did that. They stayed clear of human rights issues when they talked. They just talked about climate and energy, right?
I think that's the big question. I mean, the message from the Chinese side is that you cannot decouple these issues. You can't be friends on climate on one day and then criticize China on human rights the next day. But what the Kerry-Xi meeting showed was that this can perhaps happen, at least to a limited degree. And we're going to see, in the build-up to COP26, the climate summit later this year, if China moves, if China sort of puts some meat on the bones of its CO2 reduction goals, I think that's a big question. If Europe and the U.S. can work together on this, that's all the better.
Okay. Miriam, how do you see that yourself?
I believe that, as it was mentioned, that it's in China's interest to change its attitude towards climate change and start to be more green and make a more green production, because it knows that it will be difficult to cooperate economically furthermore if they are not going to meet the ecological standards. On the other hand, I believe that now we have to, as I said, that we have to coordinate better on the pressure. I believe that we need to stick to our values. We should not say that, okay, if China makes a move in terms of green standards, we are going to be more silent on human rights. It doesn't work like this. I believe that we really have to be principled, because we have burned our fingers, as Radek already mentioned. We started in the 90s, where we believed that our economic cooperation with China will change the other issues, will make China more free, more democratic, meet human rights standards. We already know for years that this is not working, and we were silent because we had economic gains on we believe. Now we are losing out economically too, and we should not any longer allow us to be in the trap that we are going to push for something because we believe a potential there, and we kind of hide the other values. We have to be principled in every step, and I think that only will bring revenues.
I'd like to end this with a closing thought, if anyone would like to comment on it. But Sun Tzu, The Art of War, who wrote The Art of War, the Chinese book, said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." How do you see Chinese foreign policy and European foreign policy in that regard, Radek? That's a tough question, and I'm popping this on you just like that.
The Chinese game of Go, unlike chess, is not about taking the king. It's about creating advantages and then persuading your adversary that it's in his interest to yield. We do need to study Chinese culture. This is going to be a century-long challenge. We should not censor ourselves,
right?
But we should treat China with respect. This is a large country with a rich history that has not said the last word yet.
Maybe a last word from Noah. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Europe does need to rethink its China policy. I would agree with Mr. Sikorski that Europe doesn't understand China well enough, that it needs to invest in getting to know China better. It's very hard when many people are asking themselves whether they can travel to China. These days, that makes it much more difficult. These sanctions make it more difficult. But certainly, Europe needs to invest in understanding China in order to respond to China in a joined-up, concerted way.
Noah, thank you so much. Thank you to Miriam as well, and to Radek.
Thank you.
It was really great. Thanks to all of you for watching or listening in to the CPP Group podcast, and we'll see you next time.